Hello, and we are back for our third, I think, episode of Aubrey and I guess, chatting about astrological events that are upcoming. Yes, Astro Chat. What are we going to call this?
God, I love that Astro Chat.
Okay, it's our Astro Chats. You're just hanging out with your two astrological besties. Um, and for this one, we're going to be talking about Neptune in Aries, maybe even touching on the Saturn Neptune conjunction that'll be coming up in February of 2026. So, I don't know, Aubrey, give me your thoughts maybe on what you might anticipate seeing come to life, or like what you've been ruminating on for Neptune and Aries, excuse me.
Well, okay. So as you and I have sort of touched on privately, the energy feels like a little bit elusive, right? Like a little bit difficult to pin down. I do think it's a very interesting combination. We think about Neptune, we think about dreams and spirituality and illusion and delusion and fantasy and creativity and all of these things. And then paired with Aries, the first sign of the
Hmm.
zodiac, which is ruled by Mars and is about individuality and innovation and the start of something new. Certainly it seems to me that there will be, yes, a big new cycle that is emerging, not only because Neptune is entering a new sign for the next 14 years, well, temporarily entering a new sign this year and then fully entering a new sign next year. But it seems sort of like doubly new because Aries is there. Um, I'm actually more curious about your interpretation of this. I was intending on punting this to you and being like, "So, talk to us about Neptune," because what I think one thing we did talk about was the fact that Neptune dissolved, right?
Yeah.
And we sort of see everything, especially everything material, sort of dissolving underneath Neptune, and then you think of Aries as like the individual, right, and
Hmm.
individuation and identity and all of these things. Um, and perhaps there being that sort of like sense of identity that is dissolving underneath Neptune. And in the very beginning, it will be harmonizing with Pluto and Aquarius, which is really asking us about community and the collective, and maybe having to work out the individual versus the group, and what is my identity within the collective, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to punt it over to you now.
Okay.
I want to hear
I
what
think
you think.
I think it's best maybe to start with the idea of like what even is Neptune, right?
Yeah.
It's a planet of, for people who don't know, right? It's a planet of illusions, dreams. It's a planet of spirituality, mysticism, the occult. It can be often seen as a planet of disillusionment as well, or like being disillusioned. Can also be, though, interestingly, like a planet around pharmaceuticals and drugs, both illicit and legal drugs too, because it rules kind of the effects that those things have on our bodies. It also has obviously a strong connection to water, liquid, alcohol, altered state of minds. If you're interested in Greek myth, there's a really nice kind of write up around the idea of Neptune not necessarily being Poseidon, but being Bacchus
Mm.
in the Ariel Gutman and Kenneth Johnson book, which the Mythic Astrology. I was like, oh, the name of like almost escaped me for a minute. Mythic Astrology. So I think that's worth a read if you're ever curious about kind of getting a different lens or an understanding into the archetypes of a planet. And I really love the connection that Dionysus or Bacchus has to Neptune because it also kind of speaks to like rebirth, spirituality. Literally, Bacchus was born twice. And then also like these altered state of minds and ecstasy, and then like theater, music, and art kind of go into this. Not surprisingly, Neptune also rules like photography and film, right? And glamour. When I talk about like astrology and fashion, I usually attribute it to like haute couture or um, like red carpet looks or like designer inspiration or like what collectively inspires us as well. So I think that's a good understanding of Neptune. And it can be a very elusive planet. I think, when you were like, we both can't pin it down, I think that's just the nature of Neptune in and of itself. right? It's really hard to get a clear vision of what it is because it's constantly veiled. And I mean that, not seriously, but it is constantly veiled in some way. It's foggy and cloudy. But I was kind of looking through history about Neptune and Aries, kind of going back to like even 60 CE, right? Trying to go back as far as I can. I'm like, okay, well, what happened historically when Neptune was in Aries? And a major through line that came up in particular was religious freedom, or people trying to access religious freedom, or utilizing force, Aries, war, Aries, for religious freedom, right? So back in like 66, I think CE, there was the Jewish uprising, which led to a Jewish war, which some say became a major source on Jesus, or like the rise of the iconograph uh, of Jesus. There was then in the next iteration, the religion of Catholicism and Christianity coming up in the Holy Roman Empire, or in the Roman Empire, which then eventually gave way to the Holy Roman Empire. Then in the next Neptune and Aries cycle, there was the again, there was like another rise in Christianity becoming more important, and then the splitting of different churches happening at the same time. Then again, in like the 1200s during Neptune and Aries, this is when we saw like the Christian Crusades in full swing, right? So here we are, like religious freedom through the force of war.
Mhm.
And then in the 1300s, it was 1370, I think, Neptune and Aries, there was the Hundred Years' War between England and France, which eventually created a split in the Catholic Church. And at that time, at the end of that, there were two popes that existed, and foreshadowings Protestantism, which then rose during the next Neptune and Aries cycle, which is 1534 to 1547. That was the period where we saw Henry VIII break away from Rome, declare himself as the Church of England. Martin Luther started the Protestant Reformation during that time as well, and translated the Bible into German. And then we also saw then in 1861 to 1874, that was another time of Neptune and Aries. And although, I mean, maybe it is religious freedom, right? Because that was during the Civil War in the United States. And maybe it's not so much freedom of religion, but freedom of belief,
Mhm.
and, or even freedom of people. And like the Civil Rights Act was created during that time. The Homestead Act was also created at that time. So it was this idea that like all men are being equal, although that's not necessarily true out of what came out of that period, right? We know that to be certain. It was sort of this idea of progress that created that. And it was at the hands of the enslaved people who kind of started that sort of revolution. Um, and of course, it went up the hierarchy, and people get credit for it who shouldn't, in my opinion, right? Absolutely the Black folk of America who created that. But, there was also during this time the formation of the KKK. There was also the formation of the American Red, or not the American Red Cross, but the Red Cross in
Yeah.
Switzerland. And there was, for the first time in Britain, the Trades Union Congress. It was the first national union for workers established in 1868. So we're seeing a lot of like, especially during the most recent Neptune and Aries, um, the division of power, right? Or the unification of people also happening. So it's interesting because we talk about individuation,
Hmm.
and but Neptune dissolving, maybe it is the dissolving of individuation that begins to happen, and it's like people coming together and there being like a collective force that sort
Yeah.
of supports this, especially around like common beliefs and ideas, which feel very Neptune, right? Or feeling inspired to do this. And I think we're starting to see some of these things come up. Like there was a lot of class war, there was a lot of race war, um, and in the rise of like unions becoming really important. Well, here we are again, starting
Hmm.
to see these same things and same themes unfold.
Yeah. I mean, especially here in the United States, though not limited to just the United States.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, we're starting to see, I'm going to call it fascism, take a foothold in many countries across the world, right? Like Australia is kind of battling a similar thing right now. Germany certainly is battling a similar thing in a very real way. And Canada is kind of in this like teetering point with some of this stuff too. So, it's not just the United States. That just happens
Hmm.
to be where we're living. And yeah, I mean, absolutely, we're seeing the rise of so many of those things. Trump just like created this new office in the White House around like anti-Christian bias. And so we're seeing this like marriage of religion and state in a more real way, I'm going to say,
Hmm.
than we've in a really long time, though, of course, that's always been the point of hot debate in this country. And even like right now, I think of like King Soopers here in Colorado and all of the workers being on strike. And King Soopers is now
Hmm.
suing one of the unions of their workers. And, so yeah, we're absolutely seeing that. And we're seeing a greater push, I would say, towards class consciousness here in the
Hmm.
United States and, recognizing that all of us, kind of across our lines of beliefs and whatever, who are not billionaires, right, kind of sort of have more
Hmm.
in common with the few that are at the top. Um, and of course, there's plenty of things going on in the White House with Trump and his cabinet and them dissolving a lot of things, right? Getting rid of a lot of departments in the government. And even he came out like yesterday saying that he won't listen to the courts if they are trying to like do these checks and balances and stuff. So yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing the rise of so many of these same things, unfortunately, and we will see how it all plays out, I suppose. Um, but Neptune is only in Aries temporarily this year. I think that is something
Yeah.
that is important to touch on. That is a theme actually with a lot of major transits that we're experiencing in this year. So Neptune enters Aries on March 30th, and then it stations retrograde. What do we say in July?
July 4th.
July 4th. Okay, at 2 degrees Aries.
Hmm. And then it
Okay.
re-enters Pisces October 22nd.
There you go. And then it will obviously stay in Pisces for the remainder of this year. So,
Hmm.
very similarly to kind of what we did with Pluto in Aquarius, where it kind of bounced back and forth, between Aquarius and Capricorn. Neptune is going to bounce back and forth between Aries and Pisces, and we'll get this little window basically from April until
Hmm.
October that we'll start to see a bunch of new things kind of emerging during that time that will relate to whatever we're going to do for the next 14 years. Um, but it's only kind of like a baby step, I would say, probably in that direction.
It's interesting, like you're talking about, I think it was what, the anti-Christian piece
Mhm.
of of Trump's administration. It feels like maybe something that might come up during Neptune and Aries is the false persecution of people for their
Totally.
beliefs. And when I mean false persecution, it's the false persecution maybe of Christians for their
Yeah.
beliefs, and maybe the actual persecution of people who, again, are anti-Christian. So
Mhm.
there's going to be an illusion that people are going to feel that they're persecuted, but the actual persecuted people are going to be like, hello,
Yeah.
hello, we're over here, which is again something that we've seen a lot with Neptune and Aries.
Totally. Yeah, I completely agree. And of course, not not always, but I will say the vast majority of the time, anytime we see war happening in the name of God and religion, it usually is Christian. Okay. Kind
Hmm.
of Christian belief. And, I absolutely think, unfortunately, that we will continue to kind of see the rise of like Christian nationalism and Christian
Hmm.
fundamentalism. And them, yes, very much touting that they're being targeted or persecuted or experiencing bias or whatever, when in fact they are the ones that are doing the persecuting.
Hmm.
So yeah, I do think we will continue to see that. Um, we'll see.
Well, it's interesting too because so we on one hand we have like this religious freedom and possibly the false persecution and actual persecution as a result of like freedom of religion, right? Which is a founding principle of this nation.
The balloons are like, yeah.
Yeah, they're like, and I'm also going to put nation in quotes because it's stolen land. But there's also something else that's kind of interesting is that there were advancements in like medicine. And if we remember, I mentioned that Neptune rules like pharmaceuticals and medicine um, and liquids. So one of the things that came out of the last Neptune in Aries was the invention of pasteurization, which also led to the development of like antiseptic dressing used for surgeries. So to like help remove bacteria from liquids and the body, right?
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
think this is really funny because I also think maybe in terms of like illusion, it's maybe the distrust of science and medicine, the illusion of that under the guise of wellness. Because if we think of Aries and its connection to like the self and body, and so like we have pasteurization that was patented and created during Neptune and Aries, and now this whole raw milk situation coming to rise during kind of during this Neptune or soon to be Neptune and Aries timeframe.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, when we were going over some of the historical events of these cycles of Neptune and Aries, I was very surprised at how much science was kind of coming forward during that time. But it is interesting to me, of course, that we're seeing this like push against, right, pasteurization and some of these like pretty long-term established scientific things at this point, which again is that like Neptune coming through to like dissolve things and have the illusion around things and whatever. Yes, and I think it is actually interesting that we're seeing that push come in this kind of like final moment of Neptune in Pisces, which I always think of Pisces as being like holistic and
Hmm.
wellness and these kind of alternative approaches to Western medicine, at least. And so, yeah, we're kind of seeing that in these like final moments of Neptune and Pisces. And so it makes me wonder once Neptune moves into Aries, if we'll start to see some of the real consequences of embracing something like raw milk while we're also in the throes of like bird flu starting to take over everything, listeria, right? And people being like, hey, the whole point of pasteurization is to remove bacteria. And so when you're not having that, these diseases live on in this raw
Hmm.
milk and you're going to get sick. Right. And so perhaps that will be the moment where we are seeing people get very sick and there's that kind of like return to
Yeah.
pasteurization. We'll see.
and
Um,
and true and true
every time
medicine.
I say we'll see in this video, by the way.
Phrase of the day. If anyone wants to like count the will sees and leave a comment at the bottom of this video, you're more than welcome to. I would love to know how many there are. I
I'm
expect
not
anyone
on
at the
that.
Virgo. I would say I expect anyone at the Virgo placements to be like,
Yeah,
I can do that. Pick me.
absolutely.
Or Gemini placements. It's the Mercury people. It's interesting too because some of the other things that have come up in history with Neptune and Aries is this idea of like the invisible building blocks of life and also like the micro. But if you think
Mm,
about Aries, it is like the first sign, so it is the birth of things. So it can
totally.
also be the microscopic, the things that feel invisible that we can't see, also very Neptune, that influences life. So when you're talking about like, it could be like the birth of certain types of bacteria, like you were talking about that, or the birth of maybe different types of illnesses as a result of maybe not pasteurizing or drinking pasteurized milk or not following maybe a true holistic wellness plan, which
Mm,
involves, traditional medicine, alternative wellness, and, modern medicine as well, kind of bringing all these things together. Because I think there's validity in all of little pieces,
I
so long
yeah,
as,
agree with
yeah,
you.
yeah, as so long as you're educated and you're actually like getting things from a viable source. But to kind of come back to my point about the building blocks of life, it, during a cycle of Neptune and Aries, there was an ancient Greek kind of mathematician philosopher who came up, who started to create this idea of like atomic theory. right? So like atoms starting to form, or the idea of atoms starting to form, not that they're actually forming. But then if we fast forward to the most recent Neptune and Aries cycle, we see the publishing of the periodic table of elements, which is literally, right, the invisible building blocks of all life. So we have like this established, I guess, chart or understanding of like what it is that creates us. And it has been added on over time and over years, right? But there are certain advancements that have been done in technology and science that are important to recognize during Neptune and Aries. So it's almost like this juxtaposition. And maybe to me, Neptune and Aries is about the unification of spirituality and science, right? Trying to, especially with Pluto in Aquarius being
Yes, absolutely.
sextile, right?
Hmm.
And then eventually like Saturn in Aries in the conjunction to next year in February. Like it's
And
really
Uranus
about
and
like,
Gemini.
right. It's like trying to bring all these pieces together. Like, how do we unify science and spirituality and understand that oftentimes magic or spiritual, and I didn't mean to put air quotes around magic because I do believe magic to be real, but it's often science that we have yet to explain.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. I mean, I am always touting that the future exists at the intersection of science and spirituality. So, yeah, I completely agree with you, and I mean to think that there will be greater exploration. Um, Absolutely. It also makes me think of quantum computing, and
Mhm.
very, very recently, I mean, seriously, within the past like 2 days, an article that came out about these scientists making teleportation happen, right? With the quantum computing. And I mean, that is at the most like microscopic, fundamental level that we would see something like that happening. And quantum computing really relying on like a completely different system than
Mhm.
what our sort of normal everyday computers and phones and all of that rely upon. And there's a lot that's not really understood, at least with the general public around quantum computing and all of that. So who knows? Maybe we'll continue to see that come forward. And yeah, the teleportation thing is wild, of course. So yeah, we'll see
Well,
how it
we'll
evolves.
see. Um, It'll be interesting because I believe during the last Neptune in Aries cycle, there was also a book published around like electricity and magnetism. So that's
Yeah.
like also like another invisible force. And
Mm-hmm.
like, I'm curious how that might play into this kind of quantum computing, but maybe even quantum physics becoming like
Mm-hmm.
super important. I always sometimes feel like quantum physics is like the spiritual, it's like the intersection of spirituality and science kind of coming together, and like us being able to understand things beyond our physical like realm, which also feels very like Neptune, right? But
Mm-hmm.
maybe in a more concrete, grounded, or pioneering sense, also feeling kind of Aries in that way.
I could
Mhm.
see that. There's definitely like a lot about quantum physics that is very mysterious, even to the physicists that are dedicating
Mhm.
their lives to trying to understand it and explore it. And I know that's sort of like, I think what's really intriguing to people a lot of times about quantum physics is it starts to get way out there about things such as wormholes,
Yeah.
and that idea of different realms and space travel and all of those things. And quantum physics also kind of exploring this subatomic level, which is where we start to experience the breakdown of the laws of physics as we currently understand them.
Mm-hmm.
So that being also those kind of fundamental, very invisible, right, building blocks. Maybe there will be some breakthroughs on that kind of subatomic level as well. Yeah, I love that idea. I hope that is what happens. Actually, I think that would be very interesting. So, yeah.
Um, I think other things to bring up that were invented or came out during the last Neptune and Aries cycle, or during other Neptune and Aries cycles too, I should mention, because some of this might have come before the 1861 to 1874. Some of these are earlier too, but still within the cycles. Robin Hood being the story of Robin Hood emerging during the Peasants' Revolt. That was also a Neptune and Aries. Here's the class war again, kind of coming up, right? And we're seeing a lot around class war now. We're seeing a lot with like this idea of Robin Hood. People have attributed Luigi Mangione to being a modern day Robin Hood too, right? There's very Neptune and Aries. The color photograph being something that was created during a three-colored method in 1861. And also there was a toy around like flip books and like images on a drum, creating the first moving pictures or moving images, which then gave way to film, if we remember Neptune rules photography and film. So it'd be interesting to see what sort of advancements in film might come up during this Neptune and Aries cycle.
Totally.
There was the invention of dynamite, which feels very Aries to
Yeah.
me. I'm like, oh, of course there was the invention of dynamite. Tell me more.
But in
Um,
that sense, maybe we'll see similar things on the sort of like, weapons and munition and arms front. I wouldn't be
uh,
surprised.
true. I think too that there's other commentary being made about like political or socioeconomic situations that happened during the last one, like Les Miserables, right, by Victor Hugo. That's definitely a commentary of what was going on in France at the time. There was Crime and Punishment and War and Peace were both published during Neptune and Aries. Feels very Neptune and Aries to me,
Very on the nose,
too,
yeah.
right? Um, there was the Alice in Wonderland or the Alice Adventures in Wonderland was published during Neptune and Aries. That also feels very Neptune and Aries to me. It's like this illusionary world that is, I believe people said he was drug induced. I don't know if that's actually true when writing these stories. Who knows? I mean, he kind of has to be. Maybe had to be tripping on acid. Who knows? But like we see us being taken to this really imaginary place, but it itself also being a commentary on like society and what was going on during that time too. And then um, Karl Marx publishing Das Kapital, which I'll talk about like Marxism and communism being a Saturn Neptune conjunction thing. And then lastly, Darwin published The Origin of Species right before this transit, like literally the year before. So still within orb, but then also followed up with the descent of man. So going back to the building blocks of life, the idea, like the theory of evolution, sort of emerging during Neptune and Aries. And then now we're coming back to like the fight around creationism and evolution too. Oh, and I think the last thing to mention too is that last Neptune and Aries cycle was the Impressionist movement in art. So we saw like Monet painting Impressionistic art. And I had mentioned to you more privately, but that also feels very Neptune and Aries to me. It's about like maybe not getting the full picture or the clear image when you're standing really close to something, but it almost feels molecular as well, actually. All these like little dots or little strokes. When you stand close, you can't see it, but when you look all the way back, you kind of see this really beautiful impression of an image, literally impressionist. That's very atomic,
Oh yeah,
actually.
definitely. Definitely is.
Wait, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I wonder what's going to come up around like atoms. Anyways,
We're gonna find out.
crazy.
We're gonna find out.
I know. I know. I'm like, wow.
You're so
Um,
cute.
and I was literally like, oh my gosh, I didn't even put those two things together. I was just more thinking about the impression, and then I was like, oh my God, it's literally molecular, like little strokes.
You're absolutely right.
So I think Neptune and Aries overall is going to provide us a landscape of where we're going to see a lot of juxtaposition, right? We're going to see the rise of spirituality and science kind of needing to be married, but maybe feeling like they're being pulled further apart, maybe only to come full circle towards the end of the transit or at some point during that transit. And then seeing some really incredible advancements in art and literature as a commentary to society as it is now. I think a great example of that most recently was Kendrick Lamar's Super Bowl halftime
Mm-hmm.
performance.
Absolutely.
So using like art, music, film as a way to give rise to the underdog or people who are actually being persecuted.
Yeah, I was actually gonna bring up like, do we see any major forms of like protest art during the
Hmm.
cycle of Neptune and Aries? Because that feels very Neptune and Aries, right? Like
Hmm.
We're always fighting for something with Aries, right? We're always standing up for something with Aries.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, thinking that we are quite literally making commentary on that or and fighting for something, right? Through that lens of art of all forms. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah, and I've been seeing a lot of, social media, but I've been seeing a lot of people talking about or sharing that art is a form of resistance, art is a form of rebellion, and it always has been. So maybe it's
Absolutely.
being more intentional about how we use our art, while still being active in the process of like revolution and rebellion, right? As well.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you.
So I don't know. What are you have any other thoughts around like Neptune and Aries before we kind of segue possibly into the Saturn Neptune conjunctions as well that will sort of further some of the things that we've just talked about?
I don't think so. I think definitely like seeing the rise of like folk art again, or like folk music, which is
Ooh.
always that is like commentary on um society and the things that it's because it's the music of the people, right?
Hmm.
And so I think, yeah, that really makes a lot of sense. And I think we can see so many artists exploring a lot of these ideas around like revolution and resistance and the individual as the cog in the machine and not being happy with those things and whatever. So yeah, I would actually, I think it'd be cool to see a return to stuff like that in the music.
Hmm.
So yeah, I'm excited now to see what's on the horizon actually with some of this artistic stuff. I also do wonder because I can never think about Aries without thinking of like the warrior archetype and soldiers in combat in a war and all of these things. And while the North Node was in Aries, everyone was like, "Oh, my Roman Empire is." Right. And so I just wonder like how that's going to maybe come forward and play a role, especially while we have both Neptune and Saturn in Aries. And if we see some kind of like romanticization maybe around some of those things, um or like people trying to find the warrior within perhaps, or what it is like they want to stand up and fight for, because it also with like Neptune and our beliefs, it makes me think about like standing up for what you believe in.
I love this because I also think um, maybe there's also the illusion of war, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like, I think one of the things that people keep talking about is like, oh, Neptune and Aries might bring some sort of warfare, might bring some sort of warfare, civil unrest, civil war, whatever, all these different types of conflict. But maybe the war isn't in the way that we think it is
Yeah,
either.
I can see that.
Um, I want to be clear, like this doesn't mean guns and bombs, and it can happen in other ways, in other forms of acts of resistance around protest, ousting political leaders who are pushing us towards fascism, right? And also, um, it can be the illusion that we need to start wars in other places, right, around to kind of get our point across or for a point of control. That's maybe more like a shadow side
Mhm.
as well. And we're also seeing a lot of that starting to develop too.
Hmm. but I think, okay, not like obviously we're not trying to like fear monger here, but
No.
I do think it's important when we're discussing astrology, like we'll see both, right? Or we'll see the entire kind of like spectrum, right?
Hmm.
Because like the reality is we're all like trying to work out this archetype, right? Both individually in our own lives and however this will show up in your chart, but also like collectively, right? And so I mean, unfortunately, I do think Pluto and Aquarius is a great example of this, where we're seeing like
Hmm.
the dystopian side of that emerging before maybe we'll see the like utopian side of it. And Neptune will be the same way. I'm sure Uranus will bring its own things. Saturn, like they'll all bring their own things.
Hmm.
And I just think it does a disservice actually to not acknowledge that because
Hmm.
that's reality, right? Like, yeah.
I agree. I think in order for us to prepare for anything, we have to understand what's happened historically, which is why I brought up all the historical periods around like wars or things that were fought around religious freedom, um, or using religion as a form of creating conflict. And we're seeing it. So then I guess our response to that needs to be whatever, maybe it's different. Maybe it isn't like a physical fight, but the conflict can look different, right?
Mhm.
So I agree
Mhm.
with you. I think it does a disservice to not understand what's happened historically in context and
Mhm.
in relation to what might come down the pipeline. I think it's also worth noting, and I recently said this to someone too, personally, my viewpoint on astrology is that it's anticipatory, right? It doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily mean that it is predictive, but we can
Yeah.
anticipate. So that's why I like to go back and look at what's happened before to see, like, okay, what can we anticipate from a similar cycle and how do we act on it differently, or how do we do something differently?
Yes, I that's beautifully put. I totally agree. And I think, astrology is the study of cycles, right? Like it is the study of time. And that is, I think, just naming, like we kind of have been doing at the beginning of these episodes, like naming, like, here's some things we've seen, right? Kind of consistently across these moments. It helps to give context, right? It helps to understand. And obviously, there's like plenty of different transits that are happening alongside Neptune and Aries this time, which will help to kind of, color the experience a little bit
Hmm.
differently or whatever. But we will absolutely still see some of these same things coming forward. So,
I agree. So this brings us maybe to understanding a little bit about the Neptune Saturn or the Saturn Neptune conjunction. Again, technically, it's Saturn Neptune, not Neptune Saturn, but it doesn't matter. The Saturn Neptune conjunction, which will be in February of 2026. But we're going to talk about it now because they are going to be within orb of each other this year. They will not actually meet, but they will be oh so close.
very, very close.
Oh so close to
Yeah.
meeting this year, specifically, I believe in July. That month in particular, I think that's when they'll be the closest in orb. I could be wrong, but I believe that's the
No,
time.
I think that's right. I think that's right.
Um, so I'm going to kind of do the same thing and look at historically what were some of the things that we saw during any Saturn Neptune conjunction. So, not specific to Aries, but specific to this conjunction because it happens every 36 years. So
Yeah.
it's important because we can more clearly recognize those patterns because there's more recent history that's that's happened that we can refer to. I'm going to maybe point a little bit at things happening in Russia because I've noticed this really interesting sort of rhythm that's happened with Russia and Saturn Neptune conjunctions. One being the creation of St. Petersburg as a city in Russia, which was known as the gateway to the West for Eastern culture. Um, and at that time, it was a booming, bustling city when it was created, full of like art and
Mhm.
culture. I think it's also worth noting during a Saturn Neptune conjunction in 1917, that was the year of the Russian Revolution. The year before, there was a Saturn Neptune conjunction, so still with an orb. The Karl Marx had published his whole theory as well. As we know, that gave way to a lot of rise in communism, socialism, and then also alternative thinking in Russia, and as a result, throughout the world. Um, in 1952 and 53, during that Saturn Neptune conjunction, Stalin died, right? Shifting the relationships or the shifting the power dynamic as well with Russia and the Soviet Union. That was also around the time of the Red Scare happening all over the world, but specifically in the United States, a very anti-communist campaign. And then in 1989, the most recent Saturn Neptune conjunction, we saw the fall of the Berlin Wall. And as a result, about, I think, 2 years later or a year later, the fall of the Soviet Union and then the separation. I bring this up because Saturn rules government structures and laws, and Neptune being the illusion, but also the dissolving of those things, right? So we saw like a monarchy dissolve in Russia. We saw the idea of power to the people rise. We saw it used as a weapon and laws being created against the people, right? And then we saw the dissolving of the Soviet Union and kind of the breaking apart of some of those countries back into or creating their own countries as
Mhm.
well, right? So then the preservation or the perseverance of the people coming back around. I think it's interesting to note too. that, that was also as a response to, or at the same time happening while fascism was coming on the rise. So, like, if we think about 1917, which is the Russian Revolution, well, that was also around the time of World War One, right? So we were seeing a lot of like mixed ideologies and things kind of butting heads. And now, in our current state in the world, we're seeing a lot of similar sentiments coming up, right? This rise of fascism. We're seeing, as a result, maybe like a rise in more socialist ideas also coming through as well. So it'll be interesting to see what happens around the dissolving of certain governments that as we know them now.
Mhm.
Specifically, it'll be interesting to see what comes up in Russia because Russia in particular has a really strong history around the Saturn Neptune conjunctions too.
Well, I agree with that. And I think we're kind of starting to see a lot of the groundwork being laid for some of these things. Like literally in this past week, Estonia, Latvia, and I believe Lithuania finally detached themselves fully from the electric grid with Russia, even though it was maybe more of a symbolic move at this point versus like a I don't know what the words are that I want to use, but like, they'd sort of been off of that grid, if you will, for a while and more onto this kind of like European grid. But there was just that kind of final, like, literal physical detaching, right, of
Hmm.
like, them from the electrical grid. And, of course, it still means something. And then we're seeing, obviously, the continued conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And then Georgia is currently they're on like day 76 of protests that are happening
Hmm.
in their capital Tbilisi because they are experiencing a lot of similar things in their recent election that we have accused Russia of here in the United States around election interference. And the party that won via that election, they are Russian sympathizers,
Hmm.
right? And in the Constitution in Georgia, it's literally written into the Constitution that in X number of years they were going to move to join the European bloc, right? And I
Hmm.
believe they want to become members of the EU. And it's something crazy, like 86% of the country wants to do that, right? Like this vast, vast majority. And yet, this this party that's sort of the opposite of the will of the people has won, right, and sort of taken over. And they've also delayed, like, in joining Europe and all of these things. That was part of the like first move that they did. And the president, the literal president of the country, is like, yes, Georgians, like, please rise to this and revolt against this and don't let them do this to you, basically. Um, and so we, as time goes on and we move into this kind of like Saturn Neptune period in Aries, I do wonder what we will see from Georgia and if they will hopefully, right, successfully be able
Hmm.
to do what the people want to do, and sort of free themselves from the grips of Russia. Hopefully, Ukraine will obviously be able to do the same thing. And then who knows? Okay, with Putin and whatever. Okay, but yeah, I absolutely think we'll see something, right? I mean, Russia has already been this kind of major player on the political stage for the past few years because Putin just wants to. I don't know what he wants. I don't pretend to know what that man wants, but he's sort of it has invaded Ukraine and is doing all of these things that people don't want him to do. And so it will be interesting to see how Saturn kind of comes through and points to tyranny or points to, people, leaders that apply their power in, I'm going to say, a tyrannical way versus being like the benevolent overlord, right? And Neptune coming through to like dissolve the systems and structures that
Hmm.
are not good.
I love this because one of the things I tend to tell people about Neptune is though, although it's a planet of illusion and cloudiness and maybe like not being able to see things clearly, I've noticed that when Neptune touches a planet in conjunction in particular, it cleanses it.
Yeah,
So
you've said that before.
Yeah, so the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in particular is a cleansing of the Saturnian ways, cleansing of certain rules, ideologies, structures, governments, right? And like we've seen that throughout history. We're seeing that kind of starting where we're wanting to purge and change and shift our perspective or like how we govern ourselves as different countries. Um, and maybe one of the things that because it cleanses illuminations happen or things that were once illusionary then become like into full vision or full view. Maybe we will actually have a lot more concrete evidence around maybe like election interferences or maybe things that are happening behind the scenes that we weren't necessarily aware of before. Again, Q, Pluto and Aquarius in sextile to both of these planets
Mhm.
next year as well. So 2026 is going to be interesting because we will have the exactions or some exactions of Neptune Pluto sextile, Saturn Pluto sextile. We will have um, the Uranus Neptune sextile. We will have the Saturn Uranus sextile, and then we will have the Uranus Pluto trine. All of that meaning that all of those planets are going to harmonize together. They're going to speak to each other. They're going to
Mhm.
support one another. So it gives me possible pause and hope that there's
Mhm.
something really good that can emerge from
Mhm.
these planets speaking to one another in a really nice way, too. Um, you were paused for
You
a
froze.
minute.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you were.
Oh my gosh, this
We'll have
is
to,
fun.
we'll have
Hi,
to cut
friends.
that out. Okay.
Or not. So one thing I will say is that we like to be as raw and real as possible. So if there was a freeze, you all are getting a freeze in this video. You are so welcome.
Yeah, you're
There's no
welcome.
illusions here, no Neptune. No, I'm just kidding.
Okay, no, that's fine. I support it. Obviously, that harmonization of all of the outer planets is definitely something I have my eye on and something I've been, sort of thinking about. And like, I guess it gives me hope. I think it will be interesting to see how that really manifests, right? Having all of the outer planets kind of harmonizing with one another, kind of very temporarily this year, and then the actual exaction of that happening next year. One thing I do want to say about the Neptune Saturn conjunction, and maybe just like the Neptune Saturn cycle in general. But the conjunction in particular is always a very interesting period of time for the culture, right? So it's kind of a funny dynamic to try to pin down because archetypally Saturn and Neptune are very, very different,
Mhm.
right? We've obviously already discussed some of these sort of indications of Neptune, and then, Saturn is, as you said, structure and systems and, wanting boundaries and all of these things. But also, traditionally, Saturn really does point to like separation and death and, like,
Mhm.
all of these things. And so it's because it's a transit that only happens once every 36 years, there's these sort of totally unique things that get sort of like constellated, within the collective consciousness, if you will, within the culture, that we don't see, outside of these transits. And it's, of course, interesting trying to reconcile, like, how can these two archetypes, like, what does it mean when they come together?
Mhm.
Right. And I always think that Neptune Saturn conjunctions absolutely spark something brand new. And just totally different than anything you've ever seen before that moment. And I think because it's also happening in the first sign of the zodiac in Aries, it just like amplifies that even more. Um, However, traditionally, when we see Neptune and Saturn coming together, we again kind of see these like themes and patterns, right, that kind of start to come up. But it is traditionally, historically, a time where we can see a little bit of like disillusionment from people. There's usually this kind of sentiment in the collection of like exhaustion and burnout, and almost feeling like abandoned by God in like a certain way. That's the way I'm going to describe it, anyways.
Hmm.
We see a lot of melancholy, I feel, that comes forward, at least initially, right? Again, we're going to do the whole spectrum of like possibility and emotion and manifestation here. But in the beginning, that is typically how people feel. You know, they're kind of like these systems and structures and things that we've been enduring for a long time. We're like at our breaking point with it, you know, and people do tend to feel, I'm going to say, lost a little bit, right?
Hmm.
The flip side to that is we also see sort of very powerful, unique, different things coming forward. I'm going to use Octavia Butler as an example,
Hmm.
right? Somebody who has this conjunction in their birth chart, though I don't think it's in Aries. But, you know, she has very powerful Saturn Neptune dynamic in her chart, and people are referencing her all the time now, right? As we're
Hmm.
moving towards this conjunction and being like the parable of the sower, and like, you know, and
Yes.
she was very prophetic, right? In her writings, which I absolutely think that sort of idea of like prophecy we can totally see underneath like Saturn Neptune, um, and being able to foresee and sort of be the oracle around like systems and structures and things that emerge. I forget. I had a couple other examples of people with very strong Neptune Saturn configurations in their chart, but they're all escaping me right now. In true Neptune fashion, they're escaping me. But also, typically, we see um, floods, Neptune ruling over water, right? The tsunami that we saw in Asia in 2005. I can't remember if that was, I think that was either an opposition or a square, actually. But again, this kind of major point in the Saturn Neptune cycle, we saw a tsunami. Hurricane Katrina was like another
Mhm.
thing that happened underneath. Um, a major Saturn Neptune point in the cycle. So, you know, thinking about like floods and hurricanes and whatever, and climate change fueling these things,
Mhm.
maybe we do see something with water that's really emerging, whether it's this summer while the two planets are both in Aries, or if it's kind of underneath that conjunction in February next year. In Aries, do we also see the possibility of fire? Maybe. Okay. But yeah, unfortunately, I think the hard part about Neptune and Saturn can be like death, Saturn, right? And
Mhm.
this like massive destruction that happens. So I think that will be interesting also. But I on a lighter, better note, I do also think we'll see the emergence of like incredibly powerful movements and, you know, in art and in culture, and there's just like brand new solutions and perspectives and things that will absolutely like be birthed underneath of that conjunction.
And to clarify, when you're talking about some of these Saturn Neptune cycles previously, like Hurricane Katrina and things like that, it wasn't necessarily a conjunction, but it's some other right aspect that Neptune and Saturn were creating. Because I think you bring up a good point. We can look at the conjunction that happens every 36 years, but then, as you mentioned, there are other points within that cycle that become important too when that conjunction gets activated, whether in an opposition, a square, usually, are the two.
Mhm.
Um, I also want to bring up some other little pieces, I guess, of history of most recent Saturn Neptune conjunctions. One being in 1917, that was when the there was a women's suffrage protest and picketing, the very first one at the White House, which increased like sympathy, obviously, towards the women's suffrage movement. And in 1917, the election of the first female US Congresswoman kind of coming up as well. Or maybe as a result of that, the first female Congresswoman being elected.
Oh,
Something
that was the
else.
point. I'm sorry. Sorry. That was just a point I never arrived at when I was talking about this
Yeah, it's okay.
Saturn cycle is like, yes, we might see like the massive death destruction or some kind of like tragedy,
Unrest.
right? But then Neptune comes in and you simultaneously see this outpouring of like love and compassion and empathy and wanting to help, right? And
Hmm.
wanting to heal, you know, Neptune because of whatever this kind of like destructive thing is. So I just think that that is also interesting when you think about where we're at
Yeah.
right now. And having this very like divided, polarized kind of culture going on. And then Neptune again, maybe wanting to come in and dissolve some of those boundaries. And there's some kind of like mass event that does dissolve those boundaries. And then we see the reunification of people through the process of like empathy, sympathy,
Hmm.
aid, right? So that's sorry, I had to get that out there. I was like, I'm not trying to make this doom and gloom. There's a point I'm trying to arrive at here. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
It's the ways in which unrest can create unity, right? That's truly what the idea is. And maybe again, destruction doesn't necessarily mean people have to die in mass for unity to
right.
happen, right? To be clear there. It just means
But
that
it's
maybe,
a catalyst. Yeah.
yes, there needs to be a catalyzing something that can create a better unification. Um, on a happier note, or more, I guess, less destructive note, the in another point in history with the Saturn Neptune conjunction was the 1953, I believe, is when the polio vaccine was created,
Mhm.
right? And of course, eradicated until recently. And there's this whole conversation again around like modern medicine and like life expectancy growing. Although now it's shrinking, but maybe it's also like really understanding the advancements of technology. In 1989, there were attempts to also create an AIDS vaccine as well during that time. So now we might see like the emergence of like a new type of vaccine that can support or maybe like eliminate certain things. I know that there have been a lot of trials on the eradication of HIV/AIDS that have been done as well, and they're pretty close. In some cases, I think that they actually have been able to eradicate it, not just be undetectable, but can completely eliminate it from certain test subjects. So it'll be interesting to see how like what emerges specifically around that. But then also understanding that there's been war on, right, the idea of life-saving drugs for HIV and AIDS, uh, for people who have HIV and AIDS and not maybe having access to the medications that can extend and save their lives too. That is something that we're currently seeing. So maybe it's also needing to create more pushback, right, against that. So that way there's more room for there to be growth around actually eliminating HIV and AIDS. So,
I could absolutely see that because you're right. Like there have obviously been so many advancements on the front against HIV. And yes, there was an article I saw not that long ago about a gentleman that they were able to
mhm,
eradicate that from. And I know they've been able to do it successfully in lab tests with like rats and stuff.
mhm,
Um, I would love, I mean, that would be incredible, obviously, if we're able to make that kind of final advancement underneath those transits. I also wonder now that you're bringing this up if we see some kind of renewal for like the war on drugs. Opiates obviously being this kind of huge, people do refer to it as like an epidemic in this
mhm.
country. And especially with fentanyl. And so, pharmaceuticals, okay, like maybe that makes sense. Um, Also, like Narcan coming forward and being that kind of life saving medication as well that anyone and everyone can and should get and carry
Mhm.
with them. I mean, because you just never know, right? But yeah, actually, so I wonder what advancements we'll see on that front as well.
Well, and maybe, back to your point around you were talking about like mass destruction or whatever. Maybe again, we clarified that it doesn't mean actually like people's lives being lost in like a great war way or really at all. But maybe also if we think about it historically, Saturn Neptune conjunction had brought out mass hysteria, right? Like the Red Scare I talked about, that was a mass hysteria, which like hysterical can feel very Neptune in
Mm-hmm.
nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then like the masses and like maybe the government fueling some sort of like hysteria as well. Red Scare, um, fear
Mm-hmm.
around like the AIDS epidemic, and also the war on drugs with the government fueled hysteria. that, and of course, both of those things were incorrect, right? So it's
Yeah.
the illusion that it's making things better, but it's not. It's actually creating more problems that we end up dealing with later throughout that 36-year plus cycle. And so it'll be interesting to see like what other mass hysterias are created or could be created or that we can actually keep from being created, right, under this Saturn Neptune conjunction too, most recently. That's going to come up in 2026.
I love that. I think that's such a good point too. And I just like, some of these things, as like unenjoyable as they may sound, we're just kind of in this place where it's not that far fetched, to think about some of this stuff and be like, yeah, I could totally see that happening. Interesting. I think that's a very astute observation about the mass hysteria thing.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, even like, yeah. Anyways, point being, I think the Saturn Neptune conjunction has a way to really shift, yes, the culture, bring up counterculture, right, as a way
Absolutely.
to support the shift in culture. Because I think something else that we have to understand is that yes, Neptune rules government, but Neptune also, excuse me, not Neptune, I mean Saturn. Saturn rules government, but also you have to look at the flip side of Saturn, right? It's who makes up that government, right? Who makes up the rules? Who makes up the laws? It's not always the power that be, it's the people who come together, right? To shift
Mhm.
that perspective. And Neptune being like the collective consciousness, right? It is our collective consciousness. It is us in connection that can make the changes. And again, going back to the fact that we're going to have so many positive receptions next year between the outer planets, like the time is now. This feels like a really good time to, maybe not have history repeat itself, but instead, because
Right.
it's anticipatory, we can anticipate and we can stop before it ever has to arise at all.
Yeah, I agree with you. I also wonder about the implications this time of Saturn being in its fall,
Mhm.
right? Because the last time was Saturn at home in domicile, and what that maybe means, right? Obviously, you and I have some we appreciate planets in fall and detriment. But it does make me wonder about how that maybe does manifest on like a collective scale and Saturn sort of struggling to express itself in a way that it normally wants to. Doesn't mean it's bad, it means it's different. And maybe the focus is kind of somewhere else or is something a little bit unexpected because of that.
I think that's really astute. I think it's worth maybe even saying that there can be an impulsivity, a desire to react and not be proactive. And I think to use Saturn in Aries at its benefit is to be proactive, right? I think to use it at its worst is to be reactive to something. So this is what I was talking about being anticipatory. We're going to anticipate these cycles to come up again like they did in history. What can we do? How can we shift that? How can we change it?
I love that.
Um, okay, any other thoughts on Neptune and Aries, Saturn, Neptune conjunction? Anything else before we kind of close out our little show, our time together?
Yeah, I think I am curious about your thoughts around that on like an individual level for people, right? Like obviously we're not going to cover every single possibility and like everyone's transits, but like we have such this like big picture view on it. How can we maybe like zoom that in a little bit and make it more tangible for people in like their own day-to-day lives?
Specifically the Neptune and Aries transit, you mean?
Not or just Neptune
Yeah.
Aries in general. I mean,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
whatever you want.
So so I think that's good to call out. I think sometimes, as I mentioned, like Neptune and Aries has brought up a lot around the microscopic and maybe not seeing things super close up. So we may not even understand or recognize the influence that Saturn and Aries will have on us in the moment from an individual level. I always recommend people to look at their natal chart. Where's Aries in your chart? That's where Neptune is going to transit for that 14-year cycle, briefly this year, and then in February 2026 for 14 years. I would say wherever that is in your chart, you may experience, maybe insights, intuition, awakenings, shift in perspectives. You might experience delusions in that area of your chart too. Maybe you're not seeing things clearly. It could also be like a great creative force as well. like it's going to enter my 10th house. And I keep thinking personally about, okay, well, what does that mean? Like, is there going to be something around the miscommunication or the illusion of presence or public perception, like how I'm being perceived versus how I perceive myself? So if
Mm,
that's the case, what can I do more personally to ensure that like how I see myself is coming across to other people or to many people at once? I feel like it could be a really creatively inspiring time for me.
really.
I think
Mm,
I could also have deep periods of like hermiting, going like being withdrawn from like, out of view during that time as well. I
mhm,
mean, for you, I think it's the seventh house, right? So same thing around perception, but maybe more a one-on-one level. Maybe like your roles in your relationships maybe are under review. Maybe you're going to
mm,
gain some clarity because again, Neptune cleanses. So if you have planets in Aries, it's going to cleanse anything there or angles in Aries. So maybe you'll be clarified around your roles and relationships or like what relationships are important to you, but maybe you're also idealizing certain relationships or needing, to look at them a little differently. So I think wherever Neptune will be transiting in your chart, again, wherever Aries exists, both in house and planets, that is where you're going to maybe feel some of this stuff come up, specifically around like clarity, illusion, intuition, spirituality, and creativity.
perfect.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I just think, you know, you and I are the same, right? We always want to make it like tangible for
It's
people
true.
so they know like what to do with it. So yeah, I just wanted to touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, I love it. I think I think there's a lot of little good nuggets in this video for everybody. So hopefully you got something out of it. I want to be very clear that this was not to scare anyone, but to make recognition of, historical patterns and like how we can continue to make changes today,
Mhm.
tomorrow, whenever, to support the betterment and the advancement and the progress of the people ultimately. So I just want to be clear there. But also, we wanted to make sure that you all understand what has also come up, right? And how some of, again, history repeats itself, how we're seeing some of these cycles emerge currently. With that being said, I always enjoy my time with you, Miss Aubrey. You are a wonderful little angel. What's going on? What's new? What should people know? Anything at all?
No, I don't think so.
No, no.
I don't
Stellar
know.
sex?
Yeah, okay. I can't believe you're making me do this at the end of the video. Okay. Yes, I have a book that will come out on July 8th. Stellar Sex. It is a book all about sex astrology and the erotic energy that exists within your chart, helping you to get to know it and understand it and embody it, and then to take what you have learned and apply it into your real life so you can have a better, more fulfilling love life, sex life, relationships with people in general, things like that.
Yes, absolutely. And if you want to learn more, not just about stellar sex or, about anything else in your own natal chart or, some of these transits, you can book a reading specifically with Aubrey, myself, or any other astrologer to get it, glean a little bit more insight. But we always welcome you to come and ask questions and be a part of the conversation as much as possible. So with that said,
Subscribe to
goodbye all.
Anthony's channel. Subscribe to Anthony's channel. Comment. Talk to him, etc.
Yes, especially if you want to see more videos like this. So yes, definitely
Yeah.
subscribe, you know, and come hang out with us anytime.